They were hallucinated just as the Quran and the Book of Mormon were hallucinated. Now, I may agree that those were in fact hallucinated, but I of course don't agree that the accounts of Jesus were hallucinated. He says that Jesus was originally a celestial being, just like Gabriel and Moroni, and taught his followers in the same way. But we have to, and then he says that he was euhemerized, that is, stories were created that placed him on earth interacting with historical figures. And then he says that people started believing or selling those stories as true. However, I would argue that this conclusion is a little bit sophomoric in that only Muhammad encountered the angel who gave the Quran, and only Joseph Smith found the golden tablets. The Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament were penned by over 40 different authors in real time, in real places, and with real people discovered in archaeology and other historical documents. He also talks about Philo of Alexandria. He suggests that Philo of Alexandria, he says there was a pre-Christian Jewish belief in a celestial being actually named Jesus. However, when you go and look at his book, Not the Impossible Faith, on pages 250 and 251, you'll find that it's not, in fact, talking about Jesus. In fact, the name Jesus, Yeshua, Christ, or Messiah do not appear in the complete works of Philo. They're not there. I went and double-checked it for myself. I've read through Philo. I didn't remember seeing it there, and I did double-check it. It's still not there. But this whole idea that Jesus is actually mentioned in the book of Philo's works is from On the Confusion of Tongues, where it says, "Behold, a man whose name is the East." In the Greek, that's Anatole, which means it's the rising sun. It has to do with the East, the rising sun, and hence there's this idea of risen. Well, I think that's very interesting. Could it be talking about Jesus? Well, I suppose you could make your case, but it doesn't say Jesus. So I think it's a little bit misleading to say that the name Jesus actually appears in the works of Philo, and his whole point is that Paul is simply quoting from Philo, and he's not coming up with an original idea, hence he never saw the real Jesus. He simply dug it out of a book. He also talks about he says the most plausible mythicist theory is that the incarnation, death, and burial took place in an outer space just below the moon. Now, I have no idea where he's getting that. It certainly is not in the Bible. But then he does go to things like the Revelation of Moses. It's an interesting book. It's also known as the life of Adam and Eve, but it was never considered to be canon. It was never considered to be part of the Christian works. It was always spurious. And even if you go back and look at that, nowhere does it say that Adam was actually buried just below the moon. We do not see that he was buried below the moon. That is what he suggests. If you look at it, it says that the angels Michael, Uriel, buried Adam and Abel in the parts of paradise. If you read the rest of the Bible, you see that paradise was always considered to be on earth. Gan Eden was on planet Earth. And so we need to understand that, first of all, the revelation of Moses was never considered to be part of the Christian canon. Secondly, it just doesn't say that. And then I want to also point out that Dr. Carey does not believe that people like Moses, incidentally, that he did not exist either. But in the reality, we discover that Moses existed. In fact, the Exodus has been found written in the tombs of the pharaohs. And there's some evidence that was overlooked, and it was brought to light by Brad Sparks. He's an Exodus researcher, and he shows that the story of the Exodus is actually on the tombs of the pharaohs. In fact, if you go to the Valley of the Kings, you will find that story is there. It has been misunderstood, but it's actually there. And then if we go to the next slide, what you'll find is that on those walls, in the tomb of almost every pharaoh out there, they have these depictions. You can see the walls of water. If you'll advance. Keep going. There you go. So we have the walls of water. You can see them there at the top, the walls of water. And then the water has come back in, and look who's inside that water there. A bunch of dead guys. These are called the waters of the floating corpses. It's Netu Harut in the Egyptian, which compares with the biblical Pi-ha-Kirot location at the parting of the Red Sea. But more interestingly is in there it says Netu Jacobiu. Netu Jacobiu. 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 Say that 10 times really fast. What does it sound like to you? Can you think of anybody that might have had that name? Could it be Jacob? In fact, it is. This is the water of the Jacobians. In fact, as you look throughout the tomb, you will find that it shows you hour by hour what happened in the account of the Exodus. And again, we can see a close-up, and this has been also translated by Eric Hornung in 2007. He's one of the foremost Egyptologists in the world, and he concurs that it's Netu Jacobiu, the water of the Jacobians. Also, overlooking this scene in the tombs of the pharaohs, you have this serpent standing on its tail, and it's fiery red. And the hieroglyphic caption of the fiery serpent says, "The living God who goes and comes, who changes shape, and who opens the rectangular walled corridor in the Knife Sea." The Knife Sea is referring to the Red Sea. And of course, we compare this with Exodus 13:21. The Lord went before them in a pillar of fire to give them light. You see, the Egyptians did not like this God. They equated him with the god Apophis, who was their arch enemy. They wanted to get rid of this God because he meant certain disaster for them. But again, the living God who comes and goes and who cuts a corridor in the Knife Sea. That sounds just like the Exodus. Now, this was not common knowledge in Egypt because the Egyptians were so distraught by all that happened during the Exodus. They wanted the pharaohs, the future pharaohs, to know what to do in case this should ever happen again. Because this was an incredible theological crisis. How can the pharaoh get to the next life without his body? He's been buried in the sea. What to do? And so they have all these formulas and incantations of what to do. Eric Hornung also discovered an Egyptian hieroglyphic text of the Hebrew divine name. I am that I am. Yahweh, Yahweh is what it appears in Egyptian. So we have evidence that the Exodus story is true. And they were not very excited about it. We have also the testimony of the Ipuwer papyrus. Ipuwer was a priest, and he's actually talking against the Pharaoh, which is something you're not really supposed to do. But he's giving these admonitions to the Pharaoh, and he says, "Plague is throughout the land, blood is everywhere, the river is blood, men shrink from tasting human beings and thirst after water. That is our water, that is our happiness, what shall we do in respect thereof? All is ruin." Of course, you compare that with the book of Exodus, and you find that all the waters of the river turn to blood, etc., etc. And then we also find, going on in the Ipuwer papyrus, we find the word, "Forsooth, gates, columns, and walls are consumed by fire." You compare that with Exodus, "And fire ran along the ground, and there was hail, and fire mingled with hail, very grievous." And then it talks about the wheat and the barley being destroyed. This is a direct parallel to what we have in the Bible. What is even more interesting, Brad Sparks discovered this, is that the word "forsooth" is made up of the Egyptian words Yamos. And instead of it being this word "forsooth," whatever that is supposed to mean, it actually could be a curse word. That they're using this just like we might use a curse word, if you say God something or other in the English, we're using that as a curse word, or Jesus Christ, as people so often use, as a curse. And here they're using the names Yahweh, and Moses as a curse because they are the ones responsible for what happened. So to say that there's no evidence of Moses is missing the evidence. Now, no longer considered legend, there are the people and places that existed as mentioned in the Bible. The cities Sodom and Gomorrah were recently discovered in the Ebla tablets. About 15,000 tablets were discovered, and the terms Sodom and Gomorrah were listed in there. It doesn't mean that they necessarily bought the story of what happened, but they do appear in the text, so we know that those two cities did exist. For many years, the skeptics did not believe that the Hittite people existed. But recently, the Hittite civilization has been discovered, It's from the records of the Ebla Kingdom and also cuneiform tablets discovered in Bogazkoy, Turkey, and they mention their name. So what was once scoffed at because it was only in the Bible is now common knowledge, and we can actually go and look at these places. Skeptics have also scoffed at the idea that King David ever existed. But again, now we have the House of David inscription in the 8th century. And we find it right there. It speaks of the House of David. We have Sargon, king of Assyria. He existed, but he was first mentioned in Isaiah 20. And again, skeptics did not believe that he actually existed. We find this in Isaiah 20, in the year that Tartan came to Ashdod, when Sargon, the king of Assyria, sent him and fought against Ashdod and took it. So we are indebted to the Bible for recording these things. You see, the Bible is historically accurate. We also have Belshazzar of Daniel chapter 5. He existed, but his existence was also questioned because according to recorded history, other recorded history, it was Nabonidus who was the last Babylonian king of that day. But if you read the book of Daniel carefully, you will see that it talks about Belshazzar offers Daniel to be the third in the kingdom, giving you an indication that there is somebody else. And now that we have found the cuneiform tablets, the Cyrus cylinder, we now know that Belshazzar was in fact co-regent with Nabonidus. And also Caiaphas, before whom Jesus was brought, he existed as well. And ossuary was discovered in Jerusalem with the phrase Yehosaph bar Kapha, Joseph son of Caiaphas, and it had the remains of 6 people. One of them was a man about 60 years old, and he believed the bones are believed to be those of Caiaphas. So you see, we have tremendous amount of evidence that that Jesus did exist. And though I'm running short on time, but I just want to mention that the Bible itself is not one unit. It is a collection of 66 books by 40 different authors. We put it together in one package just so that it's convenient to carry around. But it's a complete library. So I'm going to have to end there, but I thank you for your consideration, and I cede to Dr. Carey. Thank you.
Okay. Of course, we're not here to debate the existence of Moses, historicity of Moses, or any of those other characters. So that would be a completely different debate. We're only here to debate the historicity of Jesus, and it's interesting that he presented all of this evidence for Moses and Daniel and all these other people that we actually don't have for Jesus. That's quite interesting. Also, the evidence he talked about for Joan of Arc. We don't have any of that kind of evidence for Jesus either. What I also found interesting, though, is that on the Moses thing, he's choosing to go against the mainstream scholarship and choosing an isolated, what most people would call a fringe scholar, as his authority instead. So I want it to be established now that they can't use the argument against me now that I'm going against the consensus or that I'm a fringe scholar, since they're completely comfortable going against the consensus on that issue. So they're fine with saying that the consensus view that Moses didn't exist is wrong and that they can pick and choose which scholar they're going to follow. So let's do that. And in this case, let's just follow where the evidence leads rather than citing consensus arbitrarily. Now, I write in Proving History why we can't trust the consensus in Jesus studies, because it's based on methodologies that every single expert who's written a study of these methodologies has concluded are logically invalid or inapplicable in the case of the historicity of Jesus. And I cite all of these scholars and all the scholarship on that in Proving History. I won't belabor it here. Obviously, in this particular format, we have a limited amount of time, so I have to be very selective as to which things I'm going to talk about. To go further in depth on all of these things, to really explore this issue, you've got to look at my literature, you've got to look at their literature. This debate isn't going to answer all questions. So let's go straight to the evidence for Jesus. The evidence begins with the oldest documents we have, or the oldest texts that we have, which are the authentic epistles of Paul. There's 7 of them. The mainstream consensus on this is that there are only 7 authentic ones, and the later ones are forgeries. We can talk about that later if it comes up. But if we look at the authentic ones, the 7 that are believed by most scholars to be authentic, these epistles don't have any clear references to Jesus ever being on earth. They never mention Jesus having a ministry. They never mention Jesus being a miracle worker or an exorcist or a healer. They never mention disciples. They never mention there being disciples. They never mention Jesus handpicking disciples. So that's what we're looking at in the epistles. And to give you examples of what they do talk about, when we look at Romans 16, what Paul says is that all they know about Jesus, all the gospel, comes from revelation and from scriptures. No reference to human tradition, no reference to hand-picked disciples, no reference to coming from Jesus directly as a preacher in Galilee, for example. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul gives us a summary of the gospel in which the only sources he cites for the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is Scripture, and the first time he mentions in this list of events that anyone ever saw Jesus is after his death. In other words, when he appeared as a revelation to the first apostles. That's the first time he says anyone ever saw them, or saw him. And we see this in Galatians when Paul talks about what this experience is like, and he says very emphatically, it is not an experience of a normal human man, it is an experience of a revelation of Christ. So he's talking about revelations, what we would call visions, whether they were pretended or actual hallucinations, or whether he's referring to dreams, because in antiquity, dreams and hallucinations were not distinguished, or dreams and visions were often not distinguished. In Philippians 2, which we have another account of what Paul believed, and a lot of scholars believe that this account actually predates Paul because of certain stylistic elements, he talks about Jesus being a pre-existent being who descends, becomes incarnate, dies, and is resurrected. Again, no reference to miracle working, no reference to having a ministry, no reference to choosing disciples. Even in 1 Corinthians 11, when Paul quotes Jesus on the institution of the Eucharist ritual, he says he received it directly from the Lord, in other words, by revelation. And that's all we get in the epistles. We get no other concrete evidence of anything going on earth particularly. Then we get to the Gospels, which come what was then a whole lifetime later. Average human lifespan, or life expectancy for an adult back then was 48. The Gospels start to be written roughly 40 to 50 years after Jesus would supposedly have lived, and that's with the Gospel of Mark. These are written by unknown authors, by the way, and have highly mythical content. They have things like Jesus withering fig trees. We have hordes of resurrected undead coming up out of the tombs and visiting Jerusalem. Lots of stories that in any other book we would not believe them. But we have Gospels like this for other non-existent people, like Romulus, Hercules, Aesop. We have examples of this. So we're stuck wondering, well, are these like the Gospels of Romulus, Aesop, and Hercules? Or are these like legendary stories told of Alexander the Great or other historical persons? We can't tell just by saying they exist. You have to actually examine them in detail. And maybe we can get into that later in this debate. But we just can't tell just by looking at them as they are. So what we end up with is that the Gospels have all kinds of material and new claims that we don't see in the epistles, where we would expect them to be. The epistles seem to be unaware of this stuff. Then we get to the extra-biblical evidence after the Gospels. Now, this stuff starts to appear about 60 years after Jesus would have lived. And none of these examples that we might come to later in this debate, none of them can be established as independent of the Gospels or Christians quoting the Gospels. There's not a single one of them can we show that they had a source other than Christians quoting the Gospels or the Gospels directly. So those can't be used as evidence because they're not independent corroboration. So all we have are the Gospels, which all seem to be based on one Gospel, which is Mark, which comes a lifetime after these events supposedly occurred and decades after Paul wrote the epistles. Now that's it, actually. There's no eyewitness accounts, there's no there's no hostile eyewitness accounts, there's no artifacts, nothing like that. And even in terms of impact, Jesus' impact on history is no different than the impact of the angel Gabriel in the creation of Islam, for example. So you don't have to be a historical person to have impact in that sense. But we have clues to what was going on. You have to remember that the sect that survived to decide which texts would survive the Middle Ages and in what condition they would survive the Middle Ages was the one sect that believed in historical Jesus or pushed the historical Jesus as part of their creed. But we have clues to others. We have Irenaeus, who refers to certain sects that were going around at the time, claiming that the birth and other aspects of Jesus' life occurred in the heavens, and they were claiming that the Gospels were, or that the Gospel stories were allegories for this heavenly thing. We have this even in the New Testament in 2 Peter, where the common view of most scholars is that 2 Peter is a forgery because it was written in a different authorial style than 1 Peter. So it clearly wasn't written by the same author, but it refers to 1 Peter. So this is why scholars generally agree 2 Peter could not have been written by the same author as 1 Peter and therefore could not have been written by Peter. And it actually refers to these other Christians, we know nothing else about but this, that they were claiming the Gospels were cleverly devised myths, and the author of 2 Peter tries to rebut this by claiming, no, we were eyewitnesses of Jesus, and he invents an eyewitness account of meeting Jesus, which means he's trying to counteract Christians, actual Christians, who were teaching that this physical interaction, this actual meeting of Jesus didn't occur, that the gospel stories were actually allegories for higher truths. We have another example of the ascension of Isaiah, which is in the earliest reconstructible redaction of this. Scholars can date it somewhere between the 80s and 130s AD, basically the same time that the Gospels were being written, or the canonical Gospels were being written. And in this, when we look at this earliest reconstructed redaction, when we look at all of the different manuscripts, it exists in several languages, and we can see that Christians tried adding and altering it in different traditions. But when we eliminate those alterations, and we look at, for example, the version we see in Latin or in Slavonic, we find that the actual text, as it has, does not have Jesus visit earth. It actually says that he is executed by Satan and his demons in the lower heavens. So we actually have this gospel text that's actually written by some early Christian sect that we otherwise know nothing about, that taught that the drama, the passion of the Christ, is something that occurred in the lower heavens and not on earth. And we have an analogy for this in Osiris. In Osiris cult of the same time, there were public stories which had him as a historical pharaoh at a particular historical time who was later deified. But these same people who were spreading those stories had their special stories for themselves that said that those stories were allegories for the real truth, which was the cosmic truth, which has Osiris descending, becoming incarnate, dying, and then resurrecting in the lower heavens. So we had examples of this type of thinking where you have a double truth. You have the historical fictions, which are allegorical, and then you have the cosmic idea of a cosmic death and resurrection. So we have those analogies. So the usual challenges to what I'm proposing start, for example, with trying to extract history from the Gospels, but as I mentioned, the experts who've examined the methodologies for this have concluded they don't work. But one of the most common examples is to try and point to embarrassing stories in the Gospels, that no one would make up an embarrassing story. We actually know that's false. For example, the worshippers of Attis made up the story that Attis castrated himself, and that was actually one of the most embarrassing things that you could claim about your leader or deity. And yet they made it up and spread this story anyway. You wouldn't argue that there actually was a god Attis and he actually did castrate himself because no one would make this up. No, people make up embarrassing things all of the time. Oftentimes they do this as a shibboleth. In other words, a way to weed out insiders from outsiders. If it's a difficult thing to believe, then you have to commit to the faith, so you can't have free riders. So this idea of having something that's embarrassing is actually usually a cornerstone of many religions in terms of this, in order to ensure that anyone who does move in to believe this thing is committed to the faith. And also as a countercultural message. But at the same time, the things that are often claimed to be embarrassing in the Gospels aren't really very much. And we might get to some examples of that. I'll talk about John the Baptist as the most typical one that they cite. Usually it's said that they would never make up the idea that John the Baptist that Jesus would subordinate himself to John the Baptist. But in fact, the story told in Mark does not have him do that. It actually has the opposite. It has John the Baptist, the leader of the leading Baptist cult of the time, endorsing Jesus as his successor and superior explicitly. That's not embarrassing. That's exactly the kind of story you want to make up. And not only does he do that, but then the ceremony that ensues is an exact model for Christian baptism. And that's the actual point of it in the story, that Jesus is undergoing this baptismal ritual as a model for other Christians. What does he do? He's cleansed of sin and he's adopted by God. And that's exactly what what the whole idea of Christian baptism was about. It was only later that this allegorical story started to create embarrassment for certain Christians who were uncomfortable with the implications of it. Mark shows no embarrassment by the story at all. So there's no reason to think that embarrassment could explain that. It's an obvious kind of fiction that someone would make up for their particular religion. So that gets us to the other type of argument that's usually argued, which is that there are references in the epistles of Paul that could imply a historical Jesus. Usually they'll say like the reference to a crucifixion and burial, but I've already mentioned that you can have deaths and burials and so forth in the lower heavens. Paul never clearly places them on earth. He never says the Romans did it. He never says Pontius Pilate did it. He's very vague about that. So we can't come to any conclusions as to where Paul was imagining this crucifixion and burial. And in the opening of my colleague here, or my opponent, he mentioned the revelation of Moses. It's interesting that he missed the part where in the revelation of Moses it says explicitly that Garden of Eden, the paradise, was in the third heaven. And this is actually what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12. So Paul is actually an adherent of the exact same teaching that paradise, the Garden of Eden, is located in the third heaven, which means that connects him to this document and its tradition. So when the Revelation of Moses says that Adam was buried in paradise, it actually says he's brought up, raised up into the third heaven and buried there. So you can have burials in heaven, even in Jewish tradition. Usually then they'll cite, Paul often refers to teachings of Jesus. Paul doesn't exactly call them that, but he calls them commands of the Lord and such things. But we already know where Paul's getting these things. He tells us. He says he's getting them from Revelation, revelations of the Christ. Even in 2 Corinthians 12, he even relays a whole two-way conversation he's having with an outer space Jesus. This is not a conversation he's having with a historical Jesus walking around Galilee. This is a revelatory Jesus that he's getting sayings and teachings from. So we can't get anywhere with that. So then usually it will be noted that Paul twice references brothers of the Lord. And obviously if Jesus is the Lord and Jesus had brothers, he must have existed. But the problem with this is that Paul shows no knowledge of there being biological brothers of the Lord. The only brothers of the Lord he seems to be aware of are baptized Christians. And he says Jesus is the firstborn among many brethren. And in fact, baptism for Paul, as he says many times, what happens when you get baptized is that you are literally adopted by God and therefore become a son of God. And therefore you are the brother of all other sons of God, including the Son of God. So all Christians would have been brothers of the Lord. And Paul never makes a clear distinction, so we can't make anything out of that as to which thing he's talking about when he references brothers of the Lord. So then they'll reference a passage where it says that Jesus was born of the seed of David. Now, actually, the word is not the word that Paul usually uses for human birth. He uses a different Greek word. The Greek word he uses in this passage is the same word he uses for God's manufacture of Adam and for God's manufacture of our resurrection bodies. So it looks like what we're looking at is divine manufacture. And this disturbed Christians who later tried to change the one word to the other because they were also bothered by this. And the same thing we get with the born of a woman, which they'll often cite. That whole argument is about being born of the same, all of us being born of the same woman, which is an allegory, Paul says, for the natural world of flesh, as opposed to the celestial world, the celestial city. So when he's talking about that, once again, he uses the exact same word for manufacture, so he's not really talking about birth, if we follow Paul's own use of language. And he's actually explicitly saying that the entire argument he's making in that section, which is Galatians 4, is a whole discussion of allegorical motherhood and allegorical citizenship that he goes through. And he says we are born basically of the same woman that he's talking about. Everything else you look at will go the same way. And obviously I've only touched on the tip of the iceberg. There's many other arguments we can give. There can be back and forth on all of the things that I've mentioned. But when we look at all of this, the evidence for Jesus being historical is very weak. And the evidence for him originating as a revelatory being is as strong as we can expect, given the state of the evidence. Thank you.
Now we will have Mark Smith, Mr. Timer. His time will be 4 minutes. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. Good to see everybody here. I'm going to do what I label a if, blah, then blip type argument. If Bible Jesus had actually existed, the Jesus of the New Testament, if he existed, was very well known. He had face-to-face meetings with King Herod, Pontius Pilate, and the high priest. That would be the equivalent of meeting with President Obama, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Pope. Add to that the 800 men of the Roman cohort who were sent to arrest him, witnessing firsthand an amputee being healed. Several years later, the Apostle Paul told King Agrippa that these things of Jesus had not been done out of sight in some backwoods corner. And according to the Apostle John, the deeds of Jesus were so numerous, the world itself could not contain the records thereof. In short, everyone who was anyone knew who Jesus was and what he was capable of doing. Given all of this, the Romans would have conscripted Jesus to instantly heal wounded soldiers, reanimate soldiers killed in battle, eliminate logistical problems in feeding armies on the march, transport armies over unbridged rivers, wither away enemy forces via a fig tree curse, command demons to attack, and predict enemy troop movements. In light of these superhuman powers, does it really seem plausible that the following conversation between Pilate and his chief of staff would have gone down like this? So, I'm seeing Jesus today? The Jesus who can walk on water, heal the sick, and raise the dead? The Jesus who could make me, Pilate, the next emperor of Rome, and the wealthiest man on earth? That Jesus? Well, I really don't see any use for him. Let's go ahead and kill him. Does anyone really think the Romans were so stupid and blind as to not see what Jesus could have done for them? The Romans may have been a lot of things, but one thing they weren't is militarily stupid. They conquered most of the known world and held on to it far longer than any country before or since. The fact is, if Bible Jesus had actually existed, he would have been the proverbial goose that laid golden eggs, the most valuable man on the face of the planet. Whoever controlled him would have controlled the world, become rich beyond belief, even immortal. Jesus would have been the ticket for Pilate to become emperor, or the means for the Jews to finally throw off the Roman occupation. Somebody, somewhere, would have found a use for him, just like we and the Soviets did with Werner von Braun and his V-2 rocket engineers. But there are no signs whatsoever of this ever happening. If you've been told a hurricane is going on right outside your door, yet when you look out the window, all the signs of a hurricane are lacking, you know that you've been lied to. Likewise, when some dubious documents claim the biggest hurricane in human history took place around 30 AD, yet there is not one sign of a branch or leaf swaying in the wind, you know for a fact, without even opening that door, that you have been lied to. We can't open the door of history, but we can see the total and complete lack of signs in history. If Bible Jesus had actually existed, then the Romans or the Jews or somebody would have used him, and the world today would be a much different place. But it's not. Nobody ever used him because he never existed. And Christians can yell hurricane all they want, but without the leaves blowing and the trees swaying, there is no hurricane, just a lot of hot air. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And now we will move into a 30-minute period of informal discussion where the Christianity side, as well as the atheism side, will have a chance to, let's just say, discuss each other's points. So we'll open it up with Christianity side. Mr. Timer, please set our time for 30 minutes countdown, beginning now. Thank you.
Might need to hold the microphone a little closer to you, though.
Oh, hang on. Can we just pull it out of here? Maybe not. There we are.
Right. To say that there's no eyewitness accounts when people say that there are eyewitness accounts, it seems rather ad hoc that you're just deciding that,
Where are we talking about?
Well, we have a number of references. You have 1 John says that we saw him, we heard him, we touched him. Of course, we have the reference there in Peter that we were eyewitnesses to that. So we have a number of places that talk about there actually being.
So you're just talking about the letters, the epistles, 1 John and 2 Peter.
Sure.
Yeah, but we know 2 Peter is a forgery
How do we know that again?
because it's written in a different stylistic. The Greek style of it is very different from the style of 1 Peter, and it references 1 Peter. Therefore, it had to have been written after 1 Peter by someone who didn't write 1 Peter.
Because it references 1 Peter,
Mhm.
came after 1 Peter.
Yes.
Okay, I think I agree with that. 2 Peter came after 1 Peter?
Yes, but the point is, it's clearly written by a different author. So,
Well,
so if-
have you written a letter to different people?
yeah,
Do you use a different style, maybe to your wife?
Not-
or different to...
not in this sense. No, we're talking about actual proper stylistic analysis, average sentence length, vocabulary,
Yeah.
things like that.
Okay.
This is well established in the field. I mean, you can read
Sure.
Bart Ehrman's book, Forged, has a good summary of the scholarship on this.
I'm well aware of that. I question their conclusions because I don't think that they're being very objective. So, if
Well,
you had 2
yeah.
letters in front of you and you say, well, this one is clearly not the same person, even though they're both in Greek, they're both...
Yeah, we do this in courts all the time. Stylometrics is a whole forensic field. It's been used many times in courts of law to establish that a forgery has been made of a letter, for example. And using the same language, you have 2 letters in English, you can use stylometrics to prove that a different author wrote each one. It's the exact same methodology. And I think the reason you can't accept the mainstream consensus on this is because you have fundamentalist Christian beliefs, and therefore you're actually prevented from accepting that conclusion. So you have to believe that 2 Peter is an authentic doctrine, whereas I don't have to believe either.
Right. But of course, on the other hand, you would hold to the atheistic doctrine, right?
I hold to
that there is no God, and so therefore something that says it's an eyewitness account.
Well, that has nothing to do with it. I mean, I can fully accept that there was a historical Jesus. I mean, that's completely... There's 2 different things as to whether we're talking about Jesus was the Son of God or supernatural being,
Well,
or whether he existed.
The question of his divinity is beside the point.
Oh, I agree, but that's the point, is my being an atheist doesn't prevent me from believing that Jesus existed. In fact, for most of my atheist life, I was convinced that there was at least some sort of historical person that started it all. It's only actually in the last 10 years, when I started examining the evidence, that I realized that it didn't hold up. But it's perfectly acceptable, and there are many atheists who have no problem accepting that there's a historical Jesus. So, yeah, absolutely.
2 Peter 3:4 says, "Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation." Whoever wrote 2 Peter, the earlier Christians have already died off. If Peter wrote it, Peter was dead when he wrote it. That would be a true miracle. Whoever wrote Peter is saying that generation is already dead, gone, and buried.
What makes you think the fathers are talking about Christians?
It's obvious, and he's talking about the second coming.
He's not talking about...
Where is the promise of his coming, i.e. Jesus?
Right. Okay.
Since the fathers have passed away.
He goes back to creation.
It would be impossible for the Apostle Peter to have written this
But the
book.
fathers weren't Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're always considered the fathers. I mean, you have Pirkei Avot.
But they weren't the people who saw the first coming of Jesus, though.
Right, but they're talking about the fathers. These guys are Jewish, by the way.
Well, why would it matter whether...
I mean,
none of those guys met Jesus, so why would their having died have anything to do with when Jesus would return?
But he's writing to Jews. Okay?
Yeah, but that doesn't make any sense. He's talking about the expectation that Jesus should have appeared a second time by now, but the people who said that have all died.
No, he's like, okay, so where's the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continued as they were from the beginning of creation. So things have been going on.
But we're talking about the second coming of Christ, right? Not the first coming of Christ.
Yes, I fully understand that.
Yeah, so why would it be relevant that...
Because the point is that life has been going on ever since the beginning.
Yeah, but that argument doesn't make any sense in context. So your interpretation doesn't make any sense of his argument. I mean, he's trying to explain, he's saying that the originators of the religion, the first people to see Jesus, have all died off, therefore we're expecting Jesus to have come by now. He's trying to answer that argument.
Well,
why would it matter that Abraham and stuff died hundreds of years before Jesus' first coming? That wouldn't have anything to do with when his second coming.
Because the point here is that ever since the creation, since the time the fathers fell asleep, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, things have been going on.
You're basically pulling at straws. The obvious interpretation here is that it's talking about the second coming of Jesus, and there's people mocking the Christians, saying, where is the sign of his coming? And everything's continuing as it always has, the world going on as normal, and the fathers have died off. It's obvious from the context in the verse itself, the fathers is referring to the apostles, to the early Christians, to the Apostle Paul, etc., the bigwigs of the church. This was written at a time when those people were history. They've already passed. That's obvious to anybody that reads the verse.
Well, I guess it wasn't obvious to me. I'm sorry.
Actually, I can grant your interpretation as a possible reading of that verse, but it does change the argument that's being made in the passage, if that's the case. And it would even then suggest that the author of this doesn't even believe in a first coming of Jesus, because even the overthrow of the demons that's supposed to have occurred with Jesus' arrival, he's essentially denying this. Nothing has changed.
No, I mean he's, the coming that is now in view is of course his second coming. I mean, it wouldn't make any sense at that point to say, well, he's coming the first time when he's already come. They're clearly looking forward to the second. I mean, the first time he came, they're like, well, this is kind of a surprise. We didn't expect you.
And you're agreeing then that Jesus changed nothing about the world in the first coming?
No, I didn't say that.
That's what he's saying. That's what 2 Peter is saying.
Doug, in your presentation, you mentioned that people that wrote the Bible have been discovered in archaeology. We're not concerned so much with the Old Testament people here. The debate was on the existence of the Jesus of the New Testament. Could you please cite some of the archaeological evidence that, say, the Apostle Paul ever existed? Thank you.
Do you have archaeological evidence that your great-grandfather existed?
I have photographs.
Yeah, actually.
Your great-grandfather? Awesome.
Birth certificates are archaeological evidence.
Okay.
So.
Well, okay, but
let's grant. I mean, the point of your argument is that there's going to be lots of people who historically existed for whom we're not going to have archaeological evidence.
Right.
That's true.
Yeah, and we do have testimonies.
Yeah, but yes, I mean, we could pick a better example than our grandfathers, but I can grant the whole point that we can find people like that. So the question then becomes, do we have reason to doubt their historicity? And like I went through the whole sequence of evidence, I think we do in the case of Jesus. Mm-hmm. But we don't have that same kind of reasons to doubt, for example, I would say the existence of Paul, for instance. I think we can credit the existence of Paul. We don't have the kind of evidence we would need to actually doubt that, whereas we do for Jesus. The sequence of evidence is bizarre otherwise, and we have precedents for it.
Yeah, and I understand that you do not accept many of these, or maybe any of these resources or these sources, but we do have Cornelius. We have, of course, Pliny the Younger.
Oh, you mean Tacitus?
Excuse me,
yes.
Cornelius Tacitus. Excuse me, Tacitus. So there is definitely reference being made to Jesus. Now, keep in mind, the Romans did not consider the Jews to be human; they were subhuman. Okay, so
that's actually not true.
Well, it is true, actually.
Well, no. I mean, the Emperor Titus even married a Jewess. So, I mean,
she
was a Roman citizen.
A Roman, yes.
Josephus was a Roman citizen.
Yes,
he was actually elevated.
Exactly. They're elevated. Once you become a Roman citizen, then you now are part of the human race. But otherwise, they're considered dogs.
That isn't the way they categorize things. No, not at all. I mean, there may have been Romans who thought that. I'm not aware of any evidence of them thinking they were subhuman.
I do agree with this.
Yeah, no, there were tons of people who, I mean, the whole view of the Romans, the Roman view of the Jews was that they had a silly religion. They didn't regard them as not human. Quite to the contrary, they were willing to give them citizenship. They were willing to marry them. They're even willing to join their religion. There are a lot of Romans and Gentiles, Greeks and so forth, who converted to Judaism. In fact, a lot of Jews weren't racially Jews. They were converts to Judaism because Exodus provides for this. And this was fully accepted. I mean, the only problems the Romans had with the Jews was their religion, not their species.
So, Doug, the archaeological evidence for the Apostle Paul?
I'm not aware of any archaeological evidence for the Apostle Paul.
You more or less claimed there was some.
No, that was not my claim. My claim was that people who are mentioned in the Bible, such as Caiaphas. Right?
Caiaphas is an example, yeah. Oftentimes we have fictional stories that have historical characters inserted in them.
Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter. A lot of history in there.
But yes, so the idea that there were satellite characters inserted into the story doesn't establish that all the characters in the story are actual existing persons. So we can't really get anywhere with that kind of argument. I'd also like to go back to, you'd mentioned Tacitus and Pliny. Pliny actually doesn't reference a historical Jesus. He just says that these Christians worshipped a Christ figure. He doesn't say anything about his historical existence, one way or the other. But Tacitus, if the passage is authentic, I don't even think it is, but let's grant that it is for the sake of the debate, all he does is repeat what Christians were preaching in the early 2nd century. This is really very late. So you can't use him as a corroboration of the Gospels, because he doesn't say he checked these facts. He doesn't say he double-checked that the Gospels were correct, or even mentions what his source is. So we can't establish it as independent of the Gospels. Therefore, it's not usable as evidence.
Well, I would disagree with that. It's unlikely that a good historian, which you can appreciate, a good historian is going to check his sources. He's not going to just listen to rumors.
Yeah, they do that all the time.
Would you do that?
Well, no, I belong to a modern tradition of historical methodology. In fact, the methodology tradition that I'm a part of is only as recent as the 1950s. Actually, before the 1950s, methodology was worse,
right?
And that's modern methodology, whereas in antiquity, their methodology was
much
worse than
70 times Tacitus distinguishes between confirmed and hearsay accounts.
Yeah, but notice he doesn't do that here.
Well, okay.
I mean, so he actually, when he actually went through the bother of checking something, that's when he mentions it.
Okay.
Right.
So
when he doesn't mention it, he's often just repeating things that people told him. And in fact, we know one of his sources was Pliny. In fact, so he often corresponded with Pliny and got information. He asked Pliny for information to include in his histories. And we know when Pliny first encountered Christians, he had no idea what they believed and interrogated them. Didn't double check their claims at all. So we actually have an account of someone not double checking their claims. And Tacitus and Pliny were best buds, and they were actually governing adjacent provinces at the time this happened. So, in fact, the most likely source of Tacitus is his buddy Pliny, who just told him what these silly Christians were saying. And Tacitus would have found it so embarrassing that he wouldn't need to fact check it. He says, "This is ridiculous. I'm going to run with this story."
Okay.
Just like TMZ or what is the
tabloids and of course, I mean, but Tacitus or Pliny, excuse me, got some of his information by torturing certain deaconesses. And so, their story held, as it were.
But the only story he says held was that they worship a Christ.
Right, but
But even if...
I mean, when he was examining them, to examine means that they were, like, being brutally tortured, okay? So...
Well, not necessarily brutally. I mean, torture can mean all kinds of different things. So we're not actually sure
so in what
way he strong-armed them.
Painful, but not super painful, I guess, right? I mean,
but it's irrelevant because these are people in the early 2nd century. They would have these women would have no way of double-checking what the claims they were told. And we have tons of people in religious cults who believe things that are false, but they fanatically believe them anyway. So we couldn't really use that as evidence because these aren't eyewitnesses. These aren't women who would have access to any kind of corroboration of just what they were taught, which would be just what the Gospels were preaching.
Something else I'd like to point out about history. When Christians talk about history backing up their religion, they're not just intellectually curious about it as an armchair discussion in the living room. You as a Christian are willing to bet your life that there's enough evidence to prove Jesus existed and what he said was true, etc., etc. It's not just an idle curiosity. You are actually betting your life on earth, and if there's life afterwards, that one too, that all of this is true. That's a lot more. I would not bet my life on my great-great-grandfather existing, who he was, the details of his life, etc., etc. And there's probably a lot better evidence for him than there is for a Jesus. The fact that you would make such an awesome investment in time, effort, etc., and be willing to die for it, on such minimal evidence, if there even is any evidence, I think is not a wise choice in one's life.
Well, it also illustrates what we're talking about. These women would be in the same position, right? They would have no better access to the evidence necessarily than you do now, but yet they would fanatically believe it, and they would, repeat it the same way Muslims would, the same way Buddhists would, the same way even Mormons would. There are probably plenty of Mormons who would endure torture and death, insisting that the golden plates existed, even though it's pretty doubtful that they did. So that doesn't really prove anything. But anyway, Pliny doesn't actually reference any historical Jesus. He just says they worship a Christ. But if he did get this Christ story from them, they would have gotten it from the Gospels, because that's all the information that we see in the story that's in Tacitus, if even that is authentic. But I'd like to bring up, you'd mentioned, I wasn't going to mention it because I thought it was too much detail to include in such a short debate. But you mentioned Philo. In actual fact, he says that the figure in Zechariah 6 is an archangel. In particular, an archangel who is the firstborn son of God, God's high priest, celestial high priest, not the earthly high priest, the image of God, and God's agent of creation. And these are all attributes that we find Paul and the book of Hebrews assigning to Jesus, their Jesus. And it just so happens that the figure in Zechariah 6 that he's referring to is named Jesus in Zechariah 6. So we're looking at an amazing improbability here. We have someone writing before Christianity originated. He's already acknowledging that there is an archangel who has all of these peculiar attributes that was recognized in the Jewish angelology. And then we have Paul coming along. He didn't necessarily read Philo, because this is probably just an angelology that's known widely. But Paul comes along and is talking about the exact same Jesus, who's the agent of creation, the firstborn son of God, God's celestial high priest, which we have in the book of Hebrews, and the image of God. He's talking about the same kind of Jesus. That's really unlikely coincidence, unless they're actually talking about the same angelology figure, the same figure from Jewish angelology. Now, they're probably writing independently of each other, referring to a common angelology tradition within Judaism at the time. And the reason we can come to this conclusion is because it would be an enormously improbable coincidence otherwise. So that's the basis for that.
Yeah, and I understand that. I love Philo, and I think Philo has some tremendous insights. And it's almost like he is, his discussion of the Logos is something that, I as a Christian be like, it rings nicely in my ears, okay? That the word Yehoshua, or Yeshua at that case, I did not see it in the text, so I'm not sure where you got that. That was not in the actual text.
He's saying that the figure in Zechariah 6 is this figure.
Yes.
The figure in Zechariah 6 happens to be named Jesus. I mean, he would know that. He was an expert on the Scriptures. So,
yes, indeed.
Yeah, he doesn't have to actually, fill out the whole Scriptures for you. It's not
I mean, the thing is, of course, as you know, there was this huge messianic expectation, right? Ever since the fall of Adam and Eve, there had been this growing anticipation that somebody, the seed of the woman, and then it comes to the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, etc., until it goes through David, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So we know that there were many sects of Judaism that were very much expecting some kind of a Messiah figure, right? And so
but Philo's not talking about a messianic figure. He's talking about a pre-existent celestial being, an angel, an archangel, he says specifically. The idea of using this archangel as the Christ, as the Messiah, that seems to be the Christian innovation.
Well, I disagree with that. If you go back to the Targumim, you will find the Memra. And the Memra is what we translate into Greek as the Logos. And that it's the same idea. So he was this intermediary being between, let's call him God the Father or God Almighty.
Oh, certainly an intermediary being.
So there
was not
was
the same thing as the Messiah, though.
Well, I understand your nuance, but they all.
I'm just trying to figure out what your argument is. I don't quite.
Well, I'm responding to the idea that Philo was. That there was this great expectation of the Messiah back then.
So maybe it's just a misunderstanding of the evidence, what the relevance of the Philo's passage is. What Philo establishes is that there was already an archangel named Jesus who has all the attributes that the Christians are. So they're talking about the same archangel, and this is before Christianity. So you don't actually need a historical Jesus to explain where they're getting the idea of this particular being. And Paul specifically says that his Jesus is a pre-existent being. He's the agent of creation. He existed before.
Yes, and of course the Hebrew Scriptures talk about that.
They're talking about the same figure. And what happens is that the Christians appear to have taken this angel from Jewish angelology and then created a story of him descending, becoming incarnate, and resurrecting in order to be the messianic figure who would close
this is where prophecy comes in, right? I mean, this is
they're
where
using prophecy as their inspiration.
I mean, the Hebrew Scriptures have a ton of prophecy about the one who would come, and of course his name is Jesus. He's the Messiah, who's the one that did not open his mouth. I thought it was interesting that...
are you saying there's a passage in the Old Testament that says the Messiah will be named Jesus? I'm interested in that.
No, I didn't say
okay.
that. No, I did not say
I thought that would have been interesting.
That would have been interesting, yeah. He's called, of course, the branch. He's called the servant of the Lord. We believe, based on the many references, that the Malach Adonai is a reference to the pre-incarnate Jesus. So, yes, he was a figure who was hanging out in the presence of God or whatever, and then it says the Word became flesh,
right,
and dwelt among us.
That's the Christian innovation on this Jewish angelology.
Well, it's maybe the Christian culmination. Maybe that's the way to put it. But there was already a lot of expectation apart from the quote unquote Christians.
Yeah, Yeah, that doesn't negate any of the point we've made. So, yeah, sure.
But my point, what I would like to point out, though, is that this idea that Paul is, like you make a reference in, I was watching one of your debates or your presentations, and you're saying that 1 Corinthians 15, the word there for according to, that Paul wasn't, basically, he never really had a real vision of Jesus, but he was getting everything, kind of digging it out of Scripture itself. And the word kata there in the Greek, it can be according to, but it can also be in accordance with. Sure. All right, so I can say I got something, according to so and so, this is what it means, or in accordance with so and so. So that nuance there exists in that word, and it doesn't mean that Paul was.
That leaves us uncertain which he meant, right? And the key thing is in 1 Corinthians 15, he just says that. He just says, according to the Scriptures, these things happen. He doesn't mention anyone seeing them. He doesn't mention them.
Right, but we can go back to Acts, right? I mean, we have.
Well, that's not back to. That's forward. Now we're talking about 60 to 100 years later.
Well, I'm talking about the events, and of course, it wasn't 60 to 100 years later. That's.
Well, the mainstream view now is that Acts was probably written sometime around 110 or 115 AD.
Well,
certainly after 93, because it's actually using Josephus as a source.
That's not true.
No, it isn't.
Go ahead.
Well, you've got a lot of. I guess I don't think I have sound.
It needs to be closer. Yeah.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about, for I've delivered unto you the first, that which I received. Now, when did Paul receive this? Most people think it was about 32, 34 A.D. when he met with the apostles.
Well, he says he got it directly from Jesus in Galatians 1.
Well,
he says he didn't receive it through teaching, he received it through revelation, and only many years later
he met with the apostles, and they think it was about 32, 34 B.C. And what they were doing is this was.
Will have been years later that he met the apostles, though, or the other apostles. He himself says it was at least 3 years later.
Yeah. So he says, for I delivered unto you, first of all, that which I also received, how Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he rose on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, and then of the 12. This was the Christian creed. This was going on right after Jesus died.
I know. That's why it's weird that the ministry is not included in it. The idea that Jesus actually walked around and taught the gospel and actually handpicked disciples. This would be like handpicking the disciples would be one of the most crucial parts of the gospel, I would think, especially if they're relying on the tradition coming from the disciples, and yet it's completely missing from 1 Corinthians 15. He just skips right over it as if it didn't matter or it didn't exist.
Right, but you know, as an author, you can't footnote everything you say. I mean,
well, but you include extremely vital information like that. I mean,
right, but if that's
the
already
gospel
common knowledge,
if the gospel is dependent on the witness of the disciples to the life of Jesus, that is literally the most important part of the gospel, and yet it's not in there.
But if this is already common knowledge, if you don't have to go back and
well,
explain...
if it was common knowledge, you wouldn't need to repeat the whole thing, right? So was the crucifixion of Jesus. So is that he appeared to Cephas. That's all common knowledge too, and yet he's including that.
Or I mean, these letters are not to give a full expose of Jesus. They're a letter. Okay,
no, he's reciting the fundamental gospel. He's saying this is the gospel that we believe in. This is this is our most fundamental and important teaching.
He's repeating the basics, the basic creed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jesus preaching to, teaching, and selecting the disciples. That was probably more basic than all the other stuff.
I mean, with people you already know, you have an established history. You don't have to go back and give everything that you've ever talked about.
But that's what he's doing in 1 Corinthians 15. He's going back and repeating the gospel that they preach. Yeah.
That's what he's doing. He's preaching the gospel. He's not talking about selecting the apostles.
But I would think that's the most true, especially in the passage where he's talking about why
from the dead. That's the important thing. That is the gospel.
Well, no, the appearances are the most important thing as well. I mean, the other stuff is important too, but he only gets to the idea of Jesus appearing to anyone after his death. There's no ministry in there. There's no handpicking of disciples. There's nothing fundamental like that going on in this passage. That's weird. And at the very least, it's the missing. It's gone. The evidence isn't there. You can't say there was a life of Jesus, there was a ministry, there were disciples being handpicked by him in life, when Paul never mentions any of those things ever happening. And yet he mentions all these other things happening, the crucifixion and the burial and the appearances afterwards.
It's already mentioned in the Gospels. He doesn't need to mention it again.
Well, then he wouldn't need to mention all the other things either.
Right, but if you go on, he's establishing a point so that he can then go on. Now, if Christ is preached that he has been raised from the dead, how do some of you say there is no resurrection from the dead? Right, so he's establishing the point that he's already made.
Yeah.
Right? Just like you give a recap of what you said. You don't have to give everything, all the evidence, and all 500 pages of what you said.
One line. Right. He taught that he selected disciples, and then he appeared to the disciples that he selected.
So if he had said that, you would believe it?
Well, yes. If that was in the authentic letters, that would establish historicity for sure. If they said that he was actually teaching a ministry in
so
Galilee,
that one little line should have been in there to establish historicity.
One line would be pretty powerful evidence for the historicity of Jesus.
That would completely change you from an atheist to a believer.
Oh, no, that doesn't... I already established that I can accept a historical Jesus. I'm not going to immediately leap to believing that Jesus is God. I did earlier.
But I forgot it,
like
so you need to repeat that and tell me that again, okay? Because,
That's silly.
No, well then what you're saying is silly.
This is ridiculous.
What you're saying is silly. Then he has to go back and establish everything. He's going on to make a point about the resurrection. The whole chapter is about the resurrection. So he's given just kind of the very basic. Remember, guys, this is what we talk about. Remember that? Now let me go on from there. Now that I've established where I'm going, let's talk about this resurrection thing.
Yeah, but what he says is not like I'm going to skip parts. He actually says, I'm repeating to you what I taught you. So he's actually summarizing what the gospel is. And we get the same thing in Philippians 2 and various other places where he actually summarizes the gospel. The ministry's not there. There's no hand-picked disciples. No one's even referred to as a disciple. Even in 1 Corinthians 15, they're not called disciples.
One thing about the Apostle Paul, how did Paul come to believe in Jesus according to the New Testament? Paul was alive around the time that the historical Jesus should have been living. He helped persecute the Christians. He heard the stories. He held the coats when Stephen was being stoned. What convinced Paul was what we would call an hallucination, what you would call a vision. Paul wasn't convinced by any historical facts, figures, arguments, debates, or any of that stuff. He was knocked off his, excuse my French, ass by this Jesus. And then all of a sudden he decides, oh, maybe Jesus was who he said he was and was real, etc., etc. The only evidence Paul really had for the Jesus of the New Testament was an hallucination. And I don't think that's a valid foundation to base one's life on. Joseph Smith had hallucinations too. Why aren't you Mormon?
Okay, I mean this is kind of pedantic because I don't base everything on the Apostle Paul. I accept what Paul said, and the fact that he had a vision. I don't find that crazy. All right, but if he were the only person I were basing what I believe the scriptures are saying, then yeah, maybe there's an issue. But you have all these other evidences. Luke himself, according to Sir Ramsay, was a first-rate historian. So he gives us all kinds of evidence of things that were where they were supposed to be. To suddenly say that it was all just made up and it was all just a bunch of hooey, I don't accept that as being valid.
Sir Ramsay, that's over 100 years old, by the way.
So, I mean, it's still true, right?
Well, the methodology of history was substantially inferior then. Ramsay's been refuted multiple times in the last 100 years on this point.
By who?
Well, the latest scholarship is collected by Richard Purvo in his commentary on Acts for the Hermeneia series. Many other scholars concur with him on this. No, Luke is a terrible historian. Not only, I mean, he's also a dishonest historian. He not only does he get wrong some of the things that he borrows from Josephus, he gets chronology wrong and things like that, but he also completely reverses and alters the story that we get from an eyewitness account in Paul. And Paul writes in Galatians, he was never known to anyone, never seen by anyone in Jerusalem. He wasn't a Jerusalem person. When he converted, he was outside of Judea at the time, and then went to Arabia to preach the gospel, and then for 3 years, and then later came back and eventually went to Jerusalem. Acts has him in Jerusalem from the beginning, does not have him go to Arabia ever, and has him immediately go to the other apostles in Jerusalem. So Luke is completely rewriting history because he's writing the story he wants to be true, but he's completely going against this eyewitness source, Paul himself, telling us what actually happened. So we know Luke is not a reliable historian, and that's just one among many examples of this.
Thank you very much. A round of applause for both sides. perhaps I should have said, let's get ready to rumble. And now, audience members, you have been great, but it's your chance to ask the questions that you have for our panelists. So we do have a microphone here, and if someone wants to go ahead and line up, no more than 5 in a line at a time, that way we're not just standing around. And make sure your microphone is on there. Okay, as you pose your question, be mindful of the other audience members that are waiting behind you. Be brief. If you have a particular individual who you want to answer the question, call out their name. Again, there's Richard there and Mark, as well as David and Doug, or you can just pose the question and they'll answer. Are we ready? Mr. Timer, this segment will also be 30 minutes. You may begin. Thank you.
Primarily to Richard, but also to Mark. While you may have presented things that had to do with whether or not there was a lack of historicity, I would ask you whether or not that would satisfy the burden of showing that, in fact, he never existed, as opposed to that there was a lack of evidence.
Right. Yeah, that was the point of my bringing up that we have an alternative explanation of the evidence. When we look at other precedents of the sorts of things that have happened with other non-existent people being put into history, and when we look at, for example, Paul's discussions appears to be of a celestial being. We have evidence of a Christian sect who did regard Jesus as only a celestial being. And the idea of him being in history only comes basically a lifetime later, what was then an average lifespan later, in stories that are highly mythicized in their content. So when we look at the particular story arc, the pattern of evidence, it looks like the pattern of evidence we see with people who didn't exist and were basically put into history later. And that's why I think we can conclude that he didn't actually exist, because there isn't the same Jesus in Paul, and it's only many decades later that we get a sort of pretense of a historical Jesus, and there's no other evidence to support the contrary.
And I would like to point out, again, from my little reading that I did, Jesus was the goose that laid golden eggs. It's totally implausible that the Romans, the Jews, and everybody else who knew about Jesus would have just gone ahead and killed him. The fact that Jesus was never put into service by the Romans proves to me beyond the shadow of a doubt that the Jesus of the New Testament never existed. If we had a person today that could walk on water, predict the future, heal people, bring people back from the dead, grant immortality, etc., 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 you'd be darn certain there'd be people that would kidnap him, enslave him, whatever, and force him to do their will. That never took place, therefore that Jesus never existed. The Romans weren't that stupid.
Doug, Dave, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, yeah, we didn't get to have a little rebuttal on what Mark had said. First of all, I don't think the Romans were desperate for anybody. They thought they could handle things just fine. Secondly, I don't think Jesus, as you so pointed out so eloquently, he wouldn't be kidnapped by anybody. He was his own man doing his own thing. He decided to lay his life down when he felt like it. And so I think you need to at least go back and consider part of the story that your scenario is just out there. I mean, it's not going to be true for the Romans because they're not going to go conscript some loser Jew, okay? And it's not going to be true for Jesus because if he is who I believe he was, then he wasn't someone to be pushed around. He could do exactly what he wanted to.
Next question.
Yes. How do we know that the Gospels are anonymously written? I'll direct this to Richard. And how do we know when they were written?
Oh, yes. Well, there's two reasons for that. I mean, first, all of the Gospels are actually titled kata with the name following it. And that in Greek is how you designate source, not author. You would use a different form of Greek to designate author. So when those names were originally attached, someone was actually claiming that those names, whoever they were, we don't even know who they were the sources for the authors, not the authors themselves. And this you can find in mainstream scholarship on this subject. But we also don't know who they are. I mean, it doesn't say who they are. So we don't. It could have been written by those people with those names. We have no idea, but we just still don't know who these people are. So anonymity isn't necessarily the point. The problem is we don't know who they are, and they don't claim to be eyewitnesses either. We know they're not because we know Matthew, for example, copies Mark verbatim. So Matthew can't be an eyewitness because you wouldn't just copy verbatim some other dude who's not an eyewitness. You would actually tell your own eyewitness story. There's many evidences like that. Now, dating. Dating is more complicated. Obviously, the Gospels don't say when they're written, which is unusual for histories. Normally, histories would say when they're written. They often do in the ancient world. But what we do have in the Gospel of Mark are many references to the destruction of the Jewish temple. And many scholars find various places in this. And we know that occurred in 70 AD. So we know Mark is writing after that. Now, scholars actually vary widely into where Mark was written. So there are some scholars who think he was written after 140 AD. That's possible. But the earliest he could have been written would be the 70s AD. Now, there's also Mark's crucifixion narrative has about 20 parallels with another narrative of a different Jesus ben Ananias, who was killed during the war in the 60s AD. A story that's told in Josephus' Jewish War, which was written, we know, because Josephus tells us, in 75. So you could possibly even say that the Gospel of Mark is using that particular passage in Josephus and was writing after 75, for instance. So these are the kinds of things we look for. And then we know then, of course, Matthew and Luke copy Mark, so they had to have been written later. Luke inserts a lot of historical color, a lot of little historical details that we know he's getting from Josephus, particularly because the mistakes he makes in doing that can only be explained by him using Josephus. And using Josephus, another book Josephus wrote, which is the Antiquities, which we know because Josephus tells us was written in 93. So we know Luke was written after 93. And there are some scholars who argue that Luke is even writing after Papias, which would put him much later, 10 to 20, 30 years later even. So, and this is still debated within the field, but that's how you try to date them. You look for evidence that they're written after certain points in time, or that they're using certain sources that you can date, and so on.
And as far as the gospel authors being historians, a lot of atheists bring up the question of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. All the apostles are asleep. All the apostles are hundreds of feet away. Nobody is listening to the prayer of Jesus. If these are historians, how did these historians, word for word, manage to cough up the exact words of Jesus' last prayer to God? Obviously, the authors of the Gospels either made this stuff up or they had some delusions, hallucinations, and they were given this information by revelation, the same way Joseph Smith got his stuff. An historian would not have put words into Jesus' mouth like is done in the Gospels. Nobody was awake, only Jesus was there.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that according to Papias, Matthew first wrote the Gospel in Hebrew. So we have there that he says that he recorded the oracles in Hebrew and later interpreted them into Greek as best he could, it says.
You do know why that can't be true of our Matthew, right?
Why?
He's copying the Greek of Mark.
Well, unless, of course, he wrote it in Hebrew.
No, you mean if Mark wrote in Hebrew?
No, if Matthew wrote in Hebrew.
Matthew's copying the Greek of Mark verbatim. He can't possibly have written in Hebrew and also at the same time copy some other source in Greek verbatim.
Assuming, I mean, there's lots of debate as to whether Matthew or Mark came first.
Oh,
so,
well, okay. Now you're getting pretty wild in the outside the fringe.
No, it's not fringe at all.
The mainstream view.
Well,
if you're going to propose that Matthew wrote first, then you have the problem that when Matthew actually starts quoting the Bible, he's quoting the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Bible. So clearly he couldn't have written in Hebrew if he's using, a Greek source.
Well, of course, if it was in Hebrew, but then it was translated into Greek, just like Papias says, then maybe he would use the the Septuagint in that Greek version of his gospel.
But the problem is, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, you look at Dale Allison, for example, on his study of the Sermon on the Mount, the arguments and the statements in the Sermon on the Mount are based on the Greek. In other words, if they were based on the Hebrew, the sermon wouldn't make any sense. So whoever's composing the sermon is actually using the Greek as the basis for their story, or the basis of their account.
Wouldn't work. Why wouldn't it work in Hebrew?
Well, you can read Dale Allison on this. I cite him in my book on the Historicity of Jesus. Okay. But there's the actual structure of the argument made is based on certain passages, the way they're written in the Greek, and it's different than it's written in the Hebrew, and it wouldn't make as much sense. And this is how we know the Sermon on the Mount was composed in Greek. It wasn't composed in Hebrew.
So you reject Papias outright and say that it's just...
Well, there's two possible things. First of all, even Eusebius says Papias was unintelligent and not reliable.
He didn't like him, okay.
But also, he could be referring to some other source. He could be confused.
There's another Papias who's a disciple of...
There could be
Polycarp,
another...
who's a disciple of
there
John?
could be another Matthew that's not our Matthew.
I hate to interrupt you, gentlemen, but
Okay.
that may be a topic for another
Yeah,
debate.
that's true.
I see our line
Yeah, you're
steadily
right.
growing.
Well
here,
done.
So let's go ahead with our next question.
All right. This is a comment for Mark. And I wanted to respond to your thought that why didn't the Romans try to take this power that Jesus was displaying? And I just wanted to see your thoughts on what I'm thinking is that they actually did try. And the way I read the Bible is that at the end of Jesus' life, he was questioned by both Pilate and by Herod. And they tried to kind of say, well, what's this guy all about? And they had their chance. And I think maybe they were trying at that time to see, well, can we take advantage of this guy in some way? And Pilate tried, and then Herod tried, and they just tossed him back and forth. But he didn't give him an opportunity. He basically was silent. And so I would counter that they tried to see what can I get from Jesus, but he just didn't give him the opportunity. And so I think that I would counter your argument with that.
May I suggest that the speakers respond instead of discuss? That would move along the line quite quickly.
Okay. My response to that would be the United States after 9/11 took about 900 prisoners from Al-Qaeda, etc. The goal was to get them to talk, to get them to cooperate. They didn't just walk up to an Al-Qaeda member and say, excuse me, would you please cooperate with us? And the guy says, no, of course not. Oh, okay, you're free to go. Some of those people are still in prison today. And the United States is waiting for their cooperation. Pilate, Herod, etc., if the New Testament was, if Jesus was who the New Testament says he was, they would not have just asked him politely, oh, please do a trick. Oh, no, thank you. All right, you're free to go. No. They would have thrown his butt in jail. They would have tortured him. They would have kept him in prison for 20, 30 years. They would not have executed the goose that laid golden eggs. That is absurd and irrational. And in the New Testament, you have Herod waiting for a miracle. Jesus doesn't perform, so he lets him go, sends him back to the other people, Pilate. That's absurd. It is totally insane.
Okay. My question is in regards to Isaiah 53. Okay, and you would say that that's about Jesus, right?
Yes.
Okay, so what seems more logical to you? That somebody predicted the future and that Jesus really lived? Or that somebody made up a story? Because we see people borrowing so many stories throughout the Bible. So what seems more likely? That somebody just borrowed another story? Or somebody was psychic and predicted the future?
So the question is...
What seems more logical to you? That somebody predicted the future in Isaiah 53?
Yeah,
it was written before Jesus, right?
I believe that God gave that to Isaiah, and that was predicted.
And that seems more logical to you, even though so many stories seem like other stories throughout the Bible?
Yeah, it seems logical to me.
Yeah, and I think what he meant was that the alternative explanation is that Christians read Isaiah 53 and constructed their gospel based on it.
Okay. I mean, it seems illogical that you're going to come up with a God who kind of dies in the end. I mean...
Well, Isaiah 53 says the Savior is going to die, and is his death that actually secures salvation for everyone. So they're inspired by their own God's word to come up with the story. They don't need any other excuse.
By God's word?
That's his point, is what I'm saying. So
yeah. Okay.
Okay, 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 4, starting where you did. Where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. That does sound like 2 Peter is questioning whether Christ is who he says he is, unless you bother to read just one verse ahead of that. Know this, first of all, that in the last days mockers will come, future tense, with mocking, following after their own lust. Continue from there. It predicts that people will say that. It doesn't question it.
My point was that the author of 2 Peter is referring to the apostles and the people that founded the Christian faith as being dead and gone. It is impossible for if it's impossible for the apostle Peter to have written this if he was dead. And if what's written here is true, the apostle Peter had long since been dead. Therefore, it is physically impossible, unless you believe in time travel, that the apostle Peter wrote this chapter in the book of 2 Peter. It's impossible. Sorry.
Yeah, it starts.
Unless we grant their interpretation of the argument being made there, because they're saying that and I think you could construct the argument the way they're talking about. So I think there are different ways to interpret that verse, and I would concede that.
Yet it also starts, Simon Peter, it starts verse 1. Simon Peter, a servant and apostle of Jesus Christ, to them that have obtained like precious faith through us, with us through the righteousness of God and Savior, Jesus Christ. And then you go back to the next verse that you're talking about. For this they are willingly ignorant of, after he's talking about who those scoffers are, that they're willingly ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, the earth standing out of the water and in the water. So, yes, it is talking about people who, scoffers.
A very quick one for Mr. Hamp, and then hopefully more complex one for Dr. Carrier. And I'm sorry if it's Dr. Hamp and not Mr. I'm not sure which it is. Okay. For you, are you young earth creationist?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. For Dr. Carrier, you had the first guy who came up and asked you a question, I thought hit a key part of the whole argument about historicity of Jesus, which is the absence of evidence for absence. Mm-hmm. Okay. And it occurred to me as I stood in line that there's the famous Sherlock Holmes story about the dog that didn't bark. Okay. Are there places you would have expected documentation to occur that would have reflected the existence of a Jewish preacher who was well known and who was crucified? Yeah. And is that, can you cite, these are the places, like, here's a list of everyone we executed this week.
Right,
love Colonel whoever.
Unlikely we would have that.
Well, I don't know. That's
right.
why I'm looking for you to tell me.
The epistles would look very different. The epistles would be full of argumentation about what the historical Jesus said and who he said it to. And they wouldn't be written the way they're written now, where they're only talking about revelation and scripture as their only sources. They'd be talking about the testimony of people who saw Jesus and conflicts and arguments about that. So we don't see any of that in the epistles. I talk about this more in my book and the whole section on that if you want to see more examples. Earl Doherty on his website also has an actual detailed list of all the verses in Paul where you should expect to see things. And the expectation is not 100%, right? So you can look at a passage and say, well, there's maybe a 1 in 5 chance he'd mention something here. But when you're looking at all the verses in Paul, the probability that all of them would lack references to a historical Jesus is much less likely than that any particular one would.
And was there any documentation of, not Jesus, but we had this other preacher guy, and boy, was he an idiot. Or, again, I go back to we crucified this people. Didn't they keep a list of who they crucified?
No, we don't have letters. For example, we know many messianic figures that are reported in Josephus, but we don't have early letters written by their followers, for example. And if we did, and they were talking about them as celestial revelatory beings and not as people who are running around Jerusalem preaching, then we would have the same situation where the stories in Josephus would then look suspicious. We'd probably have to conclude that they began as celestial revelatory beings and only became historicized.
Was there any reference to these other messianic figures other than in Josephus?
No, but we don't expect there to be because they don't have messianic cults that came to rule the world and decided which texts would be preserved to us, right? So if Jesus ben Ananias had started a cult that then became the dominant Western religion and decided all the texts that would survive the Middle Ages, then we'd have tons of evidence for Jesus ben Ananias because they would have preserved it. But there was no cult of Jesus ben Ananias that gained power and decided which books would survive. But there was that for Jesus. So we have different expectations for Jesus than we do for other people whose cults didn't make it.
I'd like to add to that. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima ceased to exist. along with all of its records, deeds, property, documents, etc., etc., etc. If you were wanting to write an historic novel, a BS novel, let's call it, it would have been great to place it in June or July of 1945 in Hiroshima, because there would be absolutely no way to prove anything you're saying is wrong. You could say there was a guy named Joe Schmo that raised 500 people from the dead and walked on water and flew through the air, and there would be not one shred of evidence to contradict it. It's always struck me as a curiosity that Jerusalem and all of its records were burned to the ground, and then the city was knocked flat in 70 AD. Whatever records were existing were destroyed. That would be an extremely good vacuum of history in which to insert a Jesus. And what a curiosity, that's where Jesus is, in that vacuum of history. That's probably one big reason there's no written evidence for Jesus.
Okay, thank you.
Next question.
I take it that you're both atheists, and therefore I'd just like to ask you a basic logical question as distinct from the speculation that's been engaged in on this particular topic. I'd just like to know how you can account for the existence of the cosmos without violating the fallacy of infinite dependent regress.
Infinite regress. Well, there's many different possibilities.
Let's hear one.
First of all, you can have infinite regress.
No, it's a logical fallacy.
No, it's not.
Infinite dependent material regress is a logical fallacy. Look it up.
No, Look it up. This is science, relativity theory. No. It's entirely possible to have an infinite past.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
You're blowing smoke. You're really good on your speculation. I'm good on this topic.
This is established mathematics.
You are wrong. It's not a mathematical issue.
Google transfinite.
There is a difference between you get to talk a lot, okay? You get to talk a lot. Do I get to talk? Do I get to talk?
You asked me the question.
You're showing you don't understand the answer. There's a difference between a mathematical infinity and a physical infinity. You can't answer the physical question.
Is this an example of Christian?
We lost audio. Sir, thank you for the question. Please allow our panelists time to answer the question. If not, I'll have to ask you.
He's misrepresenting the issue.
Allow him to answer the question.
Allow me to answer the question. Set theory establishes that if you can have a set in mathematical theory, you can have a one-to-one correlation of physical objects to the objects in that set. You can demonstrate this as a matter of established logic. The Principia Mathematica of Bertrand Russell, for example, establishes this. So if you can have a set with infinite members, you can have a one-to-one correspondence of physical objects to those mathematical objects. Therefore, if you can have an infinite set in mathematics, you can have an infinite set in reality.
That is false.
It is not.
It is.
This is established logic.
And you won't allow me to explain, just like you monopolize their time most of the time. You do most of the talk, and that's how you win the argument.
This is not the time to explain. This is the time to ask questions.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
You're
I've
false,
answered
dude.
the question.
For your question, please. You make me a promise, you'll ask a direct question? Okay. Go ahead, please.
I'm bringing this up again, but I think it's so critical. The four Gospels, as I understand it, that Irenaeus had dismissed other writings, other traditions that were within the church at the time. And here's his thought process. I quote, "They don't have any Gospels that aren't full of blasphemy. There actually are only 4 authentic Gospels. And this is obviously true because there are 4 corners of the universe and there are 4 principal winds. And therefore, there can only be 4 Gospels that are authentic." This was his thought process, and he is the one that certified the names of the Gospels. And I find that embarrassing. Comments?
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting thought of Irenaeus. There are 4 points, though. It's kind of interesting. North, east, south, and west, for what it's worth. I have no real comment on Irenaeus. It's an interesting thought. Maybe he had some insight. Maybe he didn't. But the 4 that we have are those four. So, I don't see the church as like cherry picking like what they wanted to be in the book. It was more of a stamp of approval of what was already being circulated and what was considered to be authentic. So I don't think they're like, well, we like this one, but we don't like that one. It was, there were some that were already considered, they were in use, they were considered authentic, and they're simply putting their stamp of approval. They're not deciding what is going to be in and what's going to be out. It's some things are already in existence, like the epistles. All of them, by the way, all the epistles were being used.
I'd like to add, it's interesting to me that early Christianity picked four Gospels as being authentic, and they were awash, flooded in bogus, what they considered to be bogus Gospels, bogus prophets, false prophets, lies, deceivers, etc., etc. Jesus said, a good tree, you cannot get bad fruit from a good tree. There was lots of bad fruit in the origins of Christianity. How can Christianity today, having grown out of that cesspool, claim to be a good tree?
I have a question. First of all, on you brought up the Rome or the Egyptian soldiers all dying in the river, and yet the biggest curse was all the babies that got murdered. And it seems to me like the Egyptians didn't record all these babies that are apparently murdered by the angel of God, and then all the babies that were out in the that were killed according to by Herod. That's in no record, although it's a record in the gospel. And the second question, I guess babies aren't important, but the second one would be the Old Testament is supposed to be a witness of Christ or the coming of the Messiah, and yet when Jesus comes and doesn't really fulfill some of the main things about the lion laying down with the lamb and the swords being beaten into plowshares, it would seem to me like the Old Testament, if God's going to take the time to reveal these things to these prophets, maybe he would tell he's going to come 2 times instead of 1 time, and then leave us 1 time with really no evidence that he was there. I'd like to hear your comment on it.
Okay. Well, there is evidence that that children died. If you look in the Ipuwer Papyrus, it does refer to that. So what we have in the Tombs of the Pharaohs is simply a record of what happened that night as they were going out to recapture the Israelites. So it wasn't about all the different plagues. But the Ipuwer Papyrus, if you read that, you will find the language is astounding. Okay, and it talks about darkness. It talks about the children. And of course, the blood, obviously, I only touched upon a little bit with limited time. Secondly, Jesus is coming back. We understand that the scriptures were not all fulfilled, but the ones that were fulfilled correctly and properly. And there is another phase to this whole thing. And
does the Old Testament predict 2 phases?
The Old Testament refers to him coming lowly on a donkey. All right, it talks about his death. We see that in Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, just to mention a couple. So we see those, that he's going to be a suffering servant. We also see that he's going to be a victorious king. And the Jews have long understood this, but they say that it's 2 different messiahs. They talk about Mashiach ben Yosef, and then they talk about Mashiach ben David. So I would say, hey, you guys just put them together and you'll see that they're the one and the same. But they say, no, these are 2 different people, and so they've understood that. So yes, I think the Bible does. It doesn't say, hey, by the way, guys, there's going to be 2 comings. It doesn't use the terminology that you would use, but it uses the terminology that God directed the authors to use. And
so the purpose was I'm going to kind of like put it in code, and you got to figure it out. Is that basically?
Well, to some extent, there's a whole other side of this thing, that there is this sort of cosmic battle going on. So the references that he makes to the spiritual realm and stuff, that stuff it's true, but he leaves it there and never comes down into the flesh, where we're told very clearly that Jesus became flesh. Okay, but there is this other side of reality that we can't see, but it is there, and there's a battle that's going on, and so there's a lot of stuff that happens that had to take place to resolve all those issues too.
Thank you for your time, both of you.
Part of my question basically is I'm going to say a couple of things, and I'd like you to comment on them. But if you would extend me the grace of completing what I have to say, I'll make it very short. One thing that seems to be happening is that there's a lot of argument based on the lack of evidence of something. But that is what is known as an argument from silence. And that's a logical fallacy. One example was when you were discussing Paul, you were saying that because Paul did not quote certain things that were in the Gospels, that therefore that weakened his case. It may have weakened his case, but you can't. Is it not true that you cannot conclude from that, make a firm conclusion that Paul was in the state that you said he was? And I'll sit down and let you.
No, the argument from silence is not a fallacy. It has to be structured as an argument to probability, so you don't get logically deductive proof out of it. The question is, and I actually analyze the logical structure of arguments from silence and explain when they're valid and when they're not in Proving History. In that one book, I have a whole section on argument from silence and the logic of it. The basic idea is you compare two probabilities. The probability that there would be silence in a source if a certain thing happened, and the probability that there would be that same silence if the thing didn't happen. If those two probabilities are the same, then yes, then the argument from silence can't proceed. But if those probabilities differ, then the strength of the argument from silence is proportional to the difference between those two probabilities. So if a silence in a document is extremely unlikely, then that silence is evidence for absence. And the example, one of the main examples I give in that is the 3-hour darkening of the sun that's in Mark. If that had happened, the probability that it would not be mentioned by astronomers and historians all throughout the Roman Empire is exceedingly small. Therefore, the probability that it happened is exceedingly small. So you can build legitimate arguments from silence, but you have to do them in a logically correct way. Not all arguments from silence are valid, and they vary in their validity. It's not like it's either true or false. You get degrees of probability based on the strength of the argument.
Hi, thank you all. My question is for the Christian friends that are here. No doubt you have different views upon, well, the big questions compared to Dr. Carrier, not just about the historicity of Jesus and whether or not he existed or miracles, even God. My question is simply, if Dr. Carrier's worldview is correct, how would our world today be any different?
Well, our world would be very, very different, of course. I mean, I would argue that we wouldn't be here because without a creator, I find it very hard to get here, just like you can't have a building without a builder. So I think that's the basic big problem, the sort of a cosmic problem, if you will. But if we're only going to assume that there is no Jesus, but maybe there's still some creator or something, it's hard to say what the world would look like. I would presume that there would be, it's complete speculation, so it seems dangerous to even go to see what the world would be like. I will say this, though. What would the world be like if we had actually followed the things Jesus had told us to do? All right, because I know that there's a lot of things have been done in Jesus' name that are heinous, and they make me cringe. And when I hear about things that what people have done in Jesus' name, it makes me very sad, and I would suppose it would make Jesus very sad as well. But if we loved our neighbor as we're supposed to, which is of course in the Torah, right? We're supposed to love the Lord with all our heart, mind, and soul, and strength, and also to love our neighbor as ourselves. If we just done those two things, I think the world would be a very different place. And one reason that Jesus came, among others, but one was to teach us how to live and to demonstrate how to do that. So, just looking at his moral teachings, I think the world would be a poorer place without what he said. Not what his followers have done necessarily, but what he actually taught.
Last question.
Thank you all. Doug, you mentioned that the Bible is a collection of 66 books written by 40 or more authors. The first 5 books, the Pentateuch, contains a series of seeming contradictions. Who do you think wrote those books, and based on what evidence? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. The book of Genesis, I would argue, is actually, we talk about the redactor sometimes. I believe the redactor is none other than Moses himself, and that he has source documentation, and that is demonstrated by the word toledot, which we translate as account, but you're looking at source documents. So it talks about, this is the account or the story of creation. This is a source of story of Adam and Eve, of Seth, of Noah, etc. So, whereas, there's different theories about how Genesis was written. One is that it's the dictation theory, that God said, okay, Moses, get out a pen and I'm going to just tell you what happened. I can't rule that out, but I think it's rather improbable. I think it's more likely that Moses, being learned in all the ways of the Egyptians, which he would have also have known cuneiform, it's almost certain that he knew cuneiform as well, as a learned Egyptian, that he would have had access to documents. Now, I can't provide those documents to you. I can only show you from the evidence that seems to be there, because we have little internal evidences such as that Jacob was in Beth El, which was formerly called Luz. Okay, so there's little editorial notes that seem to suggest that it was compiled by someone the redactor, but that redactor was in fact Moses, and that's been the long-held tradition. That's what Jesus talked about. I see no other reason to suggest that it was anybody but Moses. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. A round of applause for the question and answer. Thank you. So as we come to a close on the historicity of Jesus, we've heard evidence against and evidence for, and now the closing segment. Mr. Timer, David Lehman will go first. His time will be 10 minutes. The final closing will be from Dr. Carrier. His time will be 10 minutes. I did notice in the opening session, Dr. Carrier did take an extra 4 minutes. So if there is a little grace there, I'll watch the timer. So Dr. David Lehman.
Actually, you can subtract those 4 from my closing.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. So you officially we're rounding up to 15 minutes. Is that enough time? That would be helpful. And are you ready?
Okay, so he'll do 15, I'll do 10.
That's fine.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, you've probably been wondering if I can actually talk.
No, there's no doubt about it, David.
Can you show my slides? Okay. I'm going to go really fast so you can kind of follow me. I'd like to look at the evidence for Jesus, first of all, from non-biblical sources. First of all, we got Flavius Josephus in his Antiquities, Cornelius Tacitus in Annals, and then Lucian of Samosata and the Jewish Sanhedrin. Now let's just start with Lucian of Samosata. The Christians, this is a quote from him, the Christians worship a man, and of course he was very anti-Christian, so you can see his attitude is coming through here. Worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced this new cult and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains their contempt for death and self-devotion. Their lawgiver taught they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and lived after his laws. All this they take on faith. This is in the passing of Peregrinus. Now, that was kind of an interesting story, but I won't get into it. This reference reveals several things. The Christians worship Jesus. Jesus was crucified for what he taught. Jesus started Christianity. Jesus' disciples believed Jesus' teachings, and many Christians taught that when one was converted, that he or she had eternal life. They lived by faith. They believed in Jesus. Flavius Josephus, now there are some that disputed, but the ones that are not disputed, Josephus must have mentioned Jesus in the authentic core material in 1863, since this passage is present in all Greek manuscripts of Josephus, and the Agapian version accords well with his vocabulary and grammar elsewhere. Moreover, Jesus is portrayed as a wise man, a phrase not used by Christians but employed by Josephus for such Old Testament figures as David and Solomon. Josephus' second reference to Jesus in connection with the death of his half-brother James shows no tampering whatever and is present in all Josephus' manuscripts, nor could the New Testament have served as Josephus' source since it provides no detail on James' death. The Talmud teaches that Jesus Christ was illegitimate. Of course, they were not real friendly with Jesus, and was conceived during the menstruation, that he had a soul of Esau, that he was a fool, a conjurer, a seducer, that he was crucified, buried in hell, and set up as an idol. In other words, he did those miracles by sorcery, they said. That's why he was burning in hell and excrement. That the Jews understand this story to refer to Jesus and the mother of Mary is clearly demonstrated in their book, Toldeth Deshu, the generations of Jesus, where the birth of Jesus is narrated. So in the Gospels, we see that Jesus healed a man with leprosy, Peter's mother-in-law, the Roman centurion's servant, 2 men from Gadara, a paralyzed man, a woman with bleeding, 2 blind men, a man mute and possessed, a man with shriveled hand, and a blind man mute and possessed. He healed a Canaanite woman's daughter who suffered greatly, a boy with a demon, 2 other blind men, one named a deaf mute, a man possessed in the synagogue, a blind man at Bethsaida, a crippled woman, a man with dropsy, 10 men with leprosy, a high priest's servant, the official's son at Capernaum, the sick man at the pool of Bethesda, and a man born blind. He had complete control over the forces of nature. He calmed the storms, walked on water, and fed 5,000 people here and 4,000 people there just from a few loaves and fish. He withered a fig tree, turned water into wine, and produced miraculous catches of fish. He even brought the dead back to life, including Jairus' daughter, the widow's son at Nain, and Lazarus. And as the Apostle John emphasized, there were only a few of Christ's miracles. If Jesus never did these miracles, and yet early apostles and Christians falsely claimed he did, don't you think they would have proven him a fraud? The people were still alive, and regardless of what he says, these Mark and Matthew were written about somewhere in the 50s to 60s, and of course the people were still alive. They saw this. No founder of any religion claimed to be God or perform miracles. No other prophet or founder of any religion had detailed prophecies concerning his coming, his life, his death, and his resurrection. We talked about, I lived in Salt Lake and debated Mormons for almost a year. Grant Palmer, who wrote a book, The Insider's View of Mormonism, has told, and he grew up with the 12 apostles today, said that none of the apostles today believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet. Wilhelm Weil, I had his book, he actually interviewed, he was a German medical doctor, and he went and interviewed people in, starting all the way through from Palmyra, New York, all the way to Salt Lake City, 80 people, all of them said that Joseph Smith was basically a very unsavory character. Mohammed, the Quran, Mark Gabriel, a friend of mine, was the head of the Department of Religion and History in Al-Azhar University in Cairo, and he said Mohammed was as we all probably realize, that he was a terrorist. And so almost every person that we look at, any other religion, we look at the founder, and they were not people that were doing miracles, not claiming to be sinless. William Law, a member of the first presidency, this was one of the last things that happened before Joseph Smith's untimely death. And according to William Law, Smith had several proposals to Law's wife, Jane, under the premise that Jane would enter a polyandrous marriage with Smith. And this was what was supposed to be published in the Nauvoo Expositor the very next day before Joseph Smith had the presses destroyed. According to Richard Carrier, now this is evidence for us, now this is from other books that he's written, God should be much more involved with the world. Now he thinks he shouldn't have made an imperfect universe. God shouldn't remain hidden. Instead, he should appear to all people at all times so that everyone would know that he exists. These are apparent injustices that seem to be, from my perspective, Richard's only substantial objection to theism. In his monthly column, Skeptic for Scientific American, Michael Shermer has proposed an interesting principle, affectionately named Shermer's Last Law. It states that any sufficient advanced extraterrestrial intelligence is indistinguishable from God. Hence, if any advanced alien were to come to Earth and dazzle us with advanced technology, the alien would seem like God, of course. Of course, this implies the reverse is also true. If God appeared to the entire world tomorrow morning, he would be indistinguishable from an advanced alien. Hence, according to Schirmer's last law, God could never, even in principle, give enough evidence for everyone to conclude that he exists. Even in the face of a barrage of miracles or parting of the Pacific Ocean, the skeptic would be free to say, wow, those are great, aliens are pretty amazing, aren't they? There's always been a way out for non-believers. Jesus' enemies attributed his miracles to Beelzebub. And, of course, Carey attributes the origin of life to natural causes and the resurrection of Jesus to an incredible ensemble of mass hallucinations. Schirmer offers an invincible piece of armor for the skeptic who can never be sure that God exists. Nevertheless, there is one way for God to prove his existence to everyone. He could take away our free will. We'd all become Calvinists. Whether we like it or not. Hence, all atheist demands, and all atheist demands for certainty are ultimately objections to God's gift of free will. I mean, they don't have to believe. Bearing the elimination of choice, there is nothing God could do to convince an impassioned skeptic armed with Schirmer's last law. We would even imagine skeptic living in a world of cosmic miracles, appealing to arguments similar to Richard's. If God really loved me, he wouldn't leave me in doubt as to whether these miracles I'm seeing are from God or an alien. Surely a good God would never leave us confused to his existence. Besides this, God seems to be forcing himself on everyone when he knows that we can't even be certain that he exists. If I were God, I wouldn't force myself on ignorant people. Should he hold us responsible for a choice we can't reasonably deny or make? Of course not. Hence, even in this, if this God is real, he's immoral, unfit for worship. It seems then that an atheist can never be sure God exists, regardless of what God does, so Richard's accusations can't mean that God should prove himself to everyone. This means that when it comes to things like the existence of God or evidence for miracles, Richard must demand something less than certainty. Now, consider Richard's argument, and I almost hesitate to throw this, but it's kind of fun. Richard's arguments that breasts are evidence for the non-existence of God. Female breasts do not need to be large or prominent at all as instruments for nursing. Small breasts are just as effective, while large breasts create increased strain on a woman's back and increased risk of injury or lethal malfunctions like cancer. They are a liability, a needless waste of energy. What possible use such an inefficient tactic would have in the eyes of an intelligent engineer are hard to fathom. Oddly, he dedicates his book to Jen, my buxom brunette. Nevertheless, compared to some of his other arguments, Richard's arguments from large breasts are an absolute masterpiece. I thought you might like a little humor here. So he goes so far as to claim that something that doesn't fly out of his butt must not exist. Now, this was a response to email. Since there is no observable divine hand in nature as a causal process, it is reasonable to conclude there is no divine hand. After all, there are no blue monkeys flying out of my butt is sufficient reason to believe there are no such creatures, and so it is with anything else. So this may be the worst argument ever offered by anyone. But anyway, presumably there are no monkeys of any color flying out of Richard's butt. Are we to conclude that monkeys don't exist? Neither are there fire trucks, books, planets, horses, bees, or anything emerging. These things still exist. In his debate with Michael Licona, Richard laid out his case against the resurrection. In this case, he summed it up as follows. Jesus died on a cross. His disciples, longing to make sense of the tragedy, searched the scriptures and concluded that his death had meaning. Several of Jesus' followers experienced hallucinations in which they saw visions of the risen Christ telling them that everything was okay. For some reason, and Richard never explains why, these disciples concluded that Jesus had been resurrected without his earthly body, a radical concept for first century Jews. When Christianity began to spread, Saul of Tarsus, a devout Pharisee, attempted to destroy Christianity. Nevertheless, he also experienced a hallucination in which Jesus told him to convert to Christianity. Strangely, Paul also adopted the radical view that Jesus' earthly body wasn't resurrected. A few decades later, some Christians made up an empty tomb story to illustrate their belief that Jesus' body was empty of his spirit, but they forgot to tell everyone that it was only a story. Later, Christians took the invention and seriously concluded that there was really an empty tomb and that Jesus' body must have been involved in the resurrection. Normally, a Jewish view would say that. Now, note the Jewish understanding of spiritual resurrection was practically an oxymoron. And third, in the Jewish idea that the body that dies is the same body that rises. Now, there's an overwhelming evidence against such a position. Nevertheless, Richard's problem is far greater than mere evidence, which he is free to twist to his liking. The main problem with his view is that he's completely inconsistent with his belief that Jesus never existed. Prior to his debate with Licona, Richard said Jesus might have existed,
But until better historicist view is advanced, I have to conclude at least somewhat more probable that Jesus didn't exist than he did. Then at the debate, Richard argued, there are many theories contrary to what Mr. Licona has argued, but there isn't time tonight to look at them all. I will instead present the one theory I think is most probably correct, which I only have time to summarize. Shortly after the death of Jesus, his disciples prayed, meditated, and searched the scriptures for some meaning to justify the tragedy and some way to preserve and promote the noble program of moral reform Jesus had died for. As a result, some had prophetic dreams or visions in which Jesus appeared to them, reassuring them and telling them just what they wanted to hear. Since the debate, Richard again argues that Jesus never existed. Thus we have a problem. Richard believes that Jesus probably never existed, but he also says that he thinks that most probably correct is that Jesus' disciples experienced visions of him after he died. Putting these two views together, we have this. Jesus never existed. Nevertheless, he had close companions who did exist. If you're wondering how a person who didn't exist could have followers, you may be forgetting that non-existent people can be very, very persuasive. These followers became extremely distraught when Jesus, who didn't exist, was tortured and crucified by Roman soldiers who did exist. Jesus, who didn't exist, may or may not have been placed in a tomb which may or may not have existed. After the death of their non-existent leader, the minds of the followers were so overcome by emotion that they soon experienced grief hallucinations in which they saw visions of the risen Jesus, whom nobody had ever seen to begin with. Strangely, these disciples came to believe that Jesus was resurrected without a body, probably because non-existent people don't have bodies. This caused them to become bold evangelists of the risen Lord that they had never seen. James, who did exist, the brother of Jesus, also experienced grief hallucinations when he heard that his brother, who didn't exist, had been nailed to a cross, many of which did exist. James joined the other followers, and the group became so bold that it attracted the attention of a man named Saul, who did exist. While Saul wanted to destroy Christianity because it went against everything he believed in, he was overwhelmingly attracted to the humble message of social reform. So, anyway, that gives you a little bit of an idea. But let's look at the resurrection. The importance of the resurrection for Christianity is absolutely... I'm just getting started with my talk here. The bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead is a crowning proof of Christianity. Death is the greatest enemy, and it's conquered all men but Christ. No man is wise enough to outwit death, or wealthy enough to purchase freedom from death, or strong enough to vanquish death. The grave always wins the victory. In fact, death applies not only to people but to all things. Animals die, plants die, species become extinct, and even cities and nations, like people, are born, grow for a season, and then fade away. Homes, cars, clothes, the universe itself are all subject to the universal law of decay and death, bondage or corruption. The uniqueness of the resurrection seen in even the greatest religious figures, Buddha, Muhammad, Zoroaster, Confucius, Caesar, all of these died and stayed dead. The early preaching almost always included the resurrection. We can see this. The final book, Revelation, opens with Christ's identification of himself as the first begotten of the dead, as the one that liveth and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore. The resurrection caught the disciples completely by surprise. In fact, they were frightened when they saw him, thinking that they were seeing a ghost. Here we have passages showing that the Messiah would be put to death and rise again. Even if the disciples had not been able to anticipate the resurrection from the Old Testament passages, they had clear statements from Christ's own words, seen in Matthew 12, and yet they still didn't realize it. But not only that, but you have the counting of the Omar in the appearances of Christ. He appeared to Mary Magdalene and Mark, to the other women, to Peter, to two on the road to Emmaus, to the disciples, to 11 disciples, 8 days later, to 7 disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, to over 500 followers, and these were usually men, so we're probably talking about over 2,000 people, to James, to the 11 at the Ascension. There are supposed contradictions in the stories. The historical truth of this event is proven by the combined evidences of the empty tomb, the numerous appearances, the change in the lives of the disciples. If they had an opportunity, if nobody's going to die for what they know to be a lie. The authenticity of the records, not to mention the testimony of 2,000 years of Christian history. Thomas Arnold, former professor of history at Rugby and Oxford, was one of the greatest historians the world has ever known. His testimony is, I know of no one fact in history of mankind which has proved fuller evidence of every sort to the understanding of a fair inquirer that the great sign which God hath given us, that Christ died and rose again from the dead. The whole book of Jonah illustrates that he was buried and rose again on the third day. We see the smitten rock out of which flowed water is a picture of Christ's death, and the living water is a picture of life, giving power. We got the picture of the types of Christ, the Mose Tosh bag, the three compartments, the middle one was broken, of course, and hidden. And the picture in Genesis 22 represents a picture of Christ and the type of Isaac being offered up on the altar and raised again from the dead on the third day from the time that he left. Abraham received Isaac back again. Thank you.
Another round of applause, please, for Dr. Lehman. Thank you. And now, closing arguments from Dr. Carrier here. And please be mindful of the 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Okay. Mr. Timer?
Very good. We're not here debating the existence of God, so all of that's irrelevant. I've never really actually argued that God didn't exist, and God's existence is not relevant to whether Jesus existed as a person or not. So we're going to skip that. Also, he got extremely garbled. My arguments about the resurrection got a lot of that inaccurate, but it's particularly bizarre because he's referring to work I wrote in 2005, which was when I actually was convinced that there was a historical Jesus. My conclusion changed on that several years later. So him, by conflating those two as if I was simultaneously promoting both views, is a distortion of history, first of all. So all of that can be dismissed. That's actually irrelevant now as well. I should also point out that he talked about the empty tomb. Paul never mentions anyone finding an empty tomb, even in the passage in which he gives reasons to believe in the resurrection. Reasons to believe in the resurrection, and the empty tomb being found doesn't even make the list. So the idea of there being an empty tomb appears to be a later invention, just by that evidence alone. He mentions gospel miracles. Of course, he's referring to the Gospels. I really challenge you to read chapter 10 of my book on the historicity of Jesus. That will completely alter your view of what is going on in these miracle stories and where they came from and what the authors were doing with them. But most importantly, there's no evidence any of the apostles that Paul refers to, for example, ever claimed any of these miracles occurred. Paul never refers to Jesus performing any miracles. There's no discussion of that in there. In fact, in Philippians, Paul says that Jesus divested himself of all powers and became the lowest possible being, subjecting himself to the status of a slave, not meaning a literal slave, but slave to the universe. That verse practically denies that Jesus had any miraculous powers. He's saying that Jesus abandoned all the powers of a God and became an ordinary person. So with that and all the other evidence, there doesn't seem to be any evidence of miracle working in the epistles. That only starts to appear in the Gospels, and then we have these wildly fabulous tales that are no different than many similar tales told of other gods and heroes and sorcerers of the era. So that doesn't really get us anywhere either. Then that leaves us with the people he started with. He talks about Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Sanhedrin. One of my favorite, Toledoth Yeshu, is actually a medieval work, but it is based on the Babylonian Talmud, which is he's talking about Sanhedrin. It's not a source, it's not people, it's a reference to a book of the Talmud called Sanhedrin, which is a book on the commentary on the Mishnah about the Sanhedrin, which is about how the Sanhedrin would conduct itself. But the Talmud adds commentaries in it. But the Babylonian Talmud, which is the only Talmud that references Jesus, places Jesus 100 years before, does not have him executed by Pontius Pilate, but by agents of Alexander Jannaeus, 100 years, or many years before the Romans even invaded. So they're actually placing Jesus in a different historical period. They also say he was executed in Joppa, not in Jerusalem, and there are many other accounts that he was executed by stoning, for example, and so on. It's a radically different story. But this story is first written down and first heard of in 4th or 5th century AD. So you can make of that what you will. I do discuss it more with sources on the historicity of Jesus, but it is bizarre that the Babylonian Jews had only heard of a Christianity that put Jesus 100 years before the canonical Gospels do. How does that happen to a historical person? It's very unlikely. It's more likely that that happened because we had a non-historical person. People outside the Roman Empire came up with a different historical period to put him in. People inside the Roman Empire came up with their own version based on the Roman situation at the time. So that's actually evidence for the non-existence of Jesus. He talks about Lucian. Lucian of Samosata, he wrote 160 AD. Let me repeat that. 160 AD, long after. This is over 100 years after Jesus would have lived. And all he's doing, and he explicitly says all he's doing, is just repeating what Christians told him. That's not usable as evidence. All the Christians are doing is just repeating the Gospels at him. And the Gospels, of course, we're talking about books written half a century before Lucian wrote, so that's not usable. That's all that does is prove that the Gospels were circulating at the time. That doesn't prove that the Gospels said anything that's true. He talks about Tacitus. We already talked about that plenty earlier in the debate, so I think that's covered. If you want to hear more about all of these, by the way, my book, again, I have a whole chapter just on these people. And then he gets to Josephus. Again, that doesn't prove anything because the material in Josephus, even if it's authentic, can only be coming from Christian tradition. In fact, it's been proved in the peer-reviewed literature that the main passage in Josephus is derived from the Gospel of Luke. In other words, it's using Luke as a source. I think that's better explained by it being a Christian interpolation, but even if Josephus suddenly became a really terrible writer and wrote a really terrible paragraph based on the Gospel according to Luke, all he's doing is that. That is not independent corroboration of the Gospel of Luke. And if you want that source, by the way, again, in my book, I cite the scholarship on this, establishing that that actually comes from Christian sources, comes from the Gospels. It's not independent corroboration. Even if his passage about James is authentic, all he's doing is repeating what Christians were telling him, that there was a James called the brother of the Lord or brother of the Christ, which doesn't give you an indication whether that they were saying that it was biological or cultic. Josephus wouldn't know. But in fact, it's very unlikely that Josephus actually mentioned Christ in that passage. I have a paper in a peer-reviewed academic journal establishing this quite conclusively. In my book, Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, it contains that paper, also my peer-reviewed paper on Tacitus and various other authors who's written on Jesus. But in this particular case, he just mentions James being the brother of the one called Christ. The weird thing about that is that Josephus never refers to the word Christ anywhere in his book, and we know, and anywhere in any of his books. And we know when he brings up weird terminology like that, he explains it to his Gentile readers, because the book he explicitly says was written for Gentiles. The fact that he doesn't stop and explain what a Christ is dead-on evidence that he did not write that passage. Because if Josephus wrote it, he would go, oh, but this is what a Christ is, and this is why this guy's being called the brother of the Christ, or this is why this story is going on. Only a Christian who is adding that line would not think that he had to explain what a Christ was. So that actually is demonstrably a Christian interpolation. It was added later. And he mentions that it's in all manuscripts, but we know for a fact, and we've demonstrated this, that all manuscripts of Josephus derive from a single manuscript, which is the one used by Eusebius in the 3rd century, or in the early 4th century. And we know that contained material that was not present in the same library 100 years earlier when Origen was reading Josephus in that same library that Eusebius was using. Origen is unaware of the passages that Eusebius suddenly discovers in the manuscripts 100 years later. All manuscripts that we have today derive from that one manuscript that Eusebius had, whether he's the one who doctored it or someone in the library in that 100-year period did. We don't know. But the fact that all of them are simply deriving from one manuscript, you can't use 100 copies of one document to corroborate that one document. So that pretty much gets rid of all of the evidence they've brought today. I mean, there's nothing else, essentially. And I'm not even going to use the rest of my time because I think I've adequately refuted everything that's been presented today. But I'll close with just a simple appeal, which is the fact that obviously in this debate you can't have seen every argument played out to its conclusion. There are many questions you may have. There are many other pieces of evidence that weren't even brought up on either side of this debate today. So the question can't be resolved by this debate, and we should understand that that's how all debates work. So I highly encourage you to get my books or research this in other respects, get their books or whatever books they recommend, compare the two, and make a judgment based on the different scholarship and the different fact claims and so on. Find out what the facts are. Pursue this debate yourself, individually, through your own study and understanding, and take time doing that. And I would highly encourage you to do that so that you'd have a good, informed take on this whole question. Thank you.